He had closed 1,000 deals, without a single grin. His face was known in 3 continents as the uncrackable mask of Calder Industries. Precise, immovable. A jawline that could double as a boardroom table. Cameras that followed him for charity openings instead captured a kind of corporate myth. Graham Calder, the man who never smiled. The rumor mill turned that into legend. He handled hostile takeovers with the same calm. He handled children's birthdays, no change in expression. No leaked warmth. People said it was discipline. People said it was fear. Fewer guessed it was habit. Fewer still were right. Tonight, the champagne glinted like little suns over the long tables in the Calder atrium. String lights skimmed the glass ceiling, turning the whole space into a stage. The company's annual gala was, as always, half charity, half power play. A place where philanthropic pledges doubled as strategic alliances, where a whispered name could buy a stake or sink a merger. Guests drifted like butterflies, some real, some gilded. On at the head table sat Graham, still an island of steel. Across the room, under the soft hum of polite conversation, someone was preparing a scene. Jamie had been an intern for 3 months, and had learned 3 things about large corporate events. The food was always under-seasoned, the important people moved like chess pieces, and the smallest details were often a good place to start when you wanted to know the truth. Jamie swept, literally, between trays of canapes and a stack of spare napkins. There was always a broom leaning against a service cart. Most people ignored it. Some stepped over it. Jamie saw it as a tool and a prop. A piece of stage equipment that could rearrange a scene in 5 seconds flat. Jamie was 23, quick with observation, and terrible with small talk. They had been hired to fetch coffee and ferry stacks of reports, but what the job really required was patience and a marginally unhealthy appetite for noticing the things everybody else thought too small to count. They watched people like a newscaster watches the weather. What starts as a detail becomes the story. And the story tonight was a woman who did not belong. Or at least who would have you think she did. Miranda Vale arrived like an announcement. She wore a dress that seemed to have been tailored to a photograph of light, everything the room would lean into if it could lean. Her heels tapped like punctuation. She had a smile that was too smooth, and eyes that measured a room the way an investor measures assets. She moved as if rooms opened for her on cue. One could imagine she'd never wait in line at anything. Miranda had the kind of confidence people assumed was honest because it looked so practiced. She was there with a purpose. Everyone had heard the whispered story. Evelyn Hart, the Calder family's heir in all but name, was to be honored at the gala for her sudden philanthropic pivot. She'd returned from years away studying. Some said, hiding from expectations. Others whispered, and the company had decided to celebrate her re-entry into the social circuit. That kind of narrative was convenient to a newcomer who liked an audience. Miranda made herself visible to the right people. She positioned herself near Evelyn as if proximity were a currency, and spent it, loudly, expertly. She clinked glasses in perfect rhythm, let her laughter fall on cue, and produced a velvet box, before the first course had cooled. A dramatic flourish that made 3 people in succession turn their heads. Evelyn was not built for dramatic flourish. She was small in a way the room mistook for fragility. Soft-spoken, with a laugh that faded like a candle but did not go out. She had a history with the company's board. Sure, her family lineage meant her name bore weight, but she had never wanted to be the name on building plaques. Tonight, she wore a neutral dress and a softer resolve. She had a rumor trailing her like a leash. Engagement. No one knew for sure. The rumor could be useful. The rumor could be weaponized. Miranda used it as both. The velvet box contained a ring. Of course. It gleamed. The camera phones tilted up like flowers. Tour de sun. Applause was a practiced reflex in these rooms. Applause bought favor and erased questions. Miranda accepted it as a performer accepts a cue. She took the floor and performed a little speech about finding home in the most unexpected places. And the crowd predictably bought the sentiment. Then Miranda shifted her gaze toward the calendar item that mattered most. A philanthropic grant tied to Calder Industries that would be voted on in the next board cycle. That grant would shift community partnerships and grant access to a new wing of influence. If you were the sort of person who liked opportunities and not oversight, influencing that vote quietly and appearing as a natural ally to Evelyn could be worth any price. It was a lucrative stage for someone who sold herself as a partner rather than a problem. Jamie noticed the rehearsed cadence. They also noticed the certificate. After Miranda's speech, a staff member wheeled out a centerpiece, meant to symbolize a donation an anti-kubesa, wrapped in tissue, like a secret. Card inside claimed it had been passed down through generations of benefactors and that famous auction house had authenticated it. Miranda touched it with reverence, cited its provenance, and folded her hands so the cameras caught exactly the right angle. There was applause. There were photographs. There were, crucially, murmurs of approval from a few board members who liked the optics of antiquity and authenticity. Jamie's eyes, trained on small things, found small things wrong. The vase looked too new in a certain light. The glaze had a corner chip that reflected the lights differently. The certificate's paper had a sheen more akin to printer stock than archival parchment. Jamie watched the way Miranda's fingers trembled, not in nerves, Jamie thought, but in a practiced mimicry designed to look vulnerable. The tremble was the same one Jamie had seen from a theater actress in a cabaret documentary once, designed to make onlookers give more sympathy than the situation warranted. Jamie told himself to be careful. Observation kept you employed. Hasty action got you a reprimand. Meanwhile, Graham Calder sat with his hands folded, a mountain of dark fabric and darker expression, and watched the ebb and swell of the room. He saw the ring, he saw the vase, and he heard the conversation that would determine business outcomes in the weeks to come. His eyes were planes of calculation, his voice was rations of economy. Yet when Miranda delivered her practiced lines about home and new beginnings, something like an ember flickered in the shadows of his face, a hint of amusement that made the muscles near his temples soften for a breath. It was almost too small to register. But Jamie, already trained on small things, noticed that as well. In the middle distance of the room sat an elderly man with a back like an old ledger, and a face softened by decades of ruling. Elias Langley, founder of Langley Foundation, and, for decades, the kind of chairman whose nod had closed more than his fair share of deals. Langley had watched the world with a patient scowl, and had developed the habit of speaking last and least. Tonight, he was not on the podium, but in a quiet corner speaking in low tones to a few board members. He watched Miranda as one might watch a cat climb toward a chandelier, his eyes flat with the kind of skepticism that takes years of practice to develop. Langley did not applaud the ring. He did not turn to smile. He folded his hands and made an almost invisible calculation. When the night tilted toward questions of provenance and perception, someone suggested an appraiser. That someone was Miranda, of course. She suggested it. It was a way to stamp certainty onto a narrative and to drag ambiguity into the light with the suspicion cast entirely in her direction. An appraiser would either vouch for her story or undo it publicly. The risk, if she had planned loosely, was acceptable. The reward was enormous. From where Jamie stood at the back of the room, catching a refill of sparkling water for an assistant, the idea of an appraiser felt inevitable. For a performer like Miranda, inviting scrutiny was a show of confidence, a move that said, "I have nothing to hide." For the rest of the room, it was a test-on opportunity for validation that would be used to shift votes and opinions. In these circles, a certificate could be the difference between an alliance and an audit. "Bring Dr. Rohan Price," Miranda said, loud enough to ensure the servers heard and the cameras picked up the name. He's worked with the Langley Foundation. He'll confirm a provenance should any doubt remain. Price was the sort of appraiser with the credentials to make heads nod. He had a reputation for cautious honesty, and the kind of scholarly bluntness that looked good in a press release. If he confirmed the vase, the room would tilt in Miranda's favor. A hush fell, not unlike the one during a courtroom's quiet moment before a verdict. Instruments of power, documents, witnesses, expert testimony were on the table. People settled into their chairs like they were about to watch a verdict on stage. Jamie made a decision in those seconds of hush. There are moments in a person's life when curiosity becomes responsibility. Jamie had stood at the edge of enough conversations, carried enough trays, to realize that the truth rarely revealed itself when it was invited. It was usually found when someone looked where the performance creators had hoped no one would look, like a miner tapping rock with a pick. Jamie started to peel back what the room had smoothed over. They moved through the periphery, quiet as a shadow, glancing at catering slips and the underside of the service cart. A junior staffer had been on the run all night and left coffee cups and a stack of delivery receipts behind the dessert station. On top of the pile, there was a printed invoice for decorative rentals, listing the vase as prop. Ceramic reproduction, from a company called Larkin Wren Props. The invoice was stamped with the time that matched the evening's arrival, and the address was a warehouse in a district to train stops. From where Miranda had claimed to have found the piece, it felt like a hinge. Jamie slid the invoice into an empty coat pocket and walked it past the main floor like someone carrying a stack of unused napkins. Nobody stopped them. No one else was looking at receipts. Jamie's mind started to connect dots. A printed invoice didn't make a forgery. It suggested logistics. The vase could be a prop, but the performance around it had been orchestrated with the finesse of someone who knew exactly what to say and when. Why bring an appraiser to a gala? Why invite Dr. Price, unless you were ready to gamble the truth? The gamble made sense if you were confident that Dr. Price would side with you. But what if he didn't? Back at the head table, Miranda had seized the microphone again to recount the vase's alleged lineage. A heritage line, a trace to a well-known patronage list. She floated a story and watched it spread. A few people gasped. Others folded their napkins and checked their phones. Conversation in the room resettled around her claim like flocks around a signal fire. Evelyn's hands trembled now, for real. She had been made the stage on which Miranda performed, an unwilling set piece for a narrative that suddenly threatened both her privacy and her judgment. She pushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and looked at Miranda as if she were trying to calculate whether to trust a surprise or flee one. Jamie's fingers found the broom, which leaned as if it had been waiting. The broomstick was scuffed and sensible, the end slightly splayed from overuse. In that banal object, Jamie felt the shape of a plan. A broom could do many things: sweep crumbs, clear declutter, and if used with a little theater lift, a napkin, and reveal the papers hidden beneath. It made for a good gag in old morality plays. The lowly servant who sees what the proud cannot. Love of detail can be dangerous in corporate settings. Jamie knew that. But tonight, the danger felt like a better alignment than complacency. The room was being rearranged not by truth but by theatrics. Someone had to interrupt the show. Before Jamie could move, a hush settled around Dr. Rohan Price's arrival. Price entered quietly, an air of academia softened by expensive loafers. He took the vase on inspection and turned it gently in his hands. He squinted at the glaze, at the impressed maker's mark, at the faint numbers stamped beneath the base. Interesting, bracesetto, sotto voce. The kind of word that rolls over corporate ears and becomes a headline. He removed the gloves he wore for show and made a few notes on a leather pad. People leaned in. Miranda arranged her face to look patient. Evelyn tried to look nonchalant. Langley folded his hands and watched Price like someone watching a slow-moving avalanche. "These marks," Price said, fingertip landing on the maker's stamp, "are not what they appear. I'll need to inspect the certificate and run a quick provenance check. With the registry I use, it will take 10 minutes. 10 minutes in a room tuned for spectacle feels like a small eternity. Murmurs floated up like bubbles. A board member murmured to another. The people who had placed friendly bets on Miranda's performance found themselves suddenly patting their pockets for a different kind of currency. Patience. Langley only watched. Miranda's smile thinned. Her hands hovered as if to take the vase back and to set a new tone. Confident, she made a move toward the staff as if to produce documents. It was then Jamie noticed the assistant who'd been hovering near Miranda. He was too clean, too composed, with a headset in his ear, and a watch that suggested a call schedule more elaborate than social niceties. He moved more like a stage manager than a friend. Jamie waited until the assistant turned away, then they slipped behind a curtain of palms near the service entrance. The broom, chosen for its invisibility, as much as its practicality, leaned warm against Jamie's palm. They kept their steps small, and their breath measured. People had stolen conversations tonight. Sometimes people had to steal evidence. In the galley behind the main floor, Jamie found a stack of file folders labeled with the Gala's PR items. Tucked beneath a printed biography of Miranda Vale was a compact, laminated certificate, slick, new, and with an embossed seal that looked suspiciously familiar. The signature line bore the name Remington Heritage, a fictional name Jamie had seen floating through art blog feeds as a reputable source of certification. The certificate was clearly printed with the list. The emboss felt lighter than it should. Jamie flipped it over and found, on the reverse, a small barcode sticker, and a tiny printed label. Lark and Wren Prop Sorter, number 43,291. The shriek you can hear in print was the logic aligning. Invoice, label, props company. A certificate printed to look like an antique provenance sheet. Something else in Jamie's hand clinked. It was a stray lapel pin. A small piece of costume jewelry with an enamel badge that matched the headsetted assistant's cuff. A discard, perhaps, or a clue. Jamie folded the certificate into their jacket. The broom's handle was warm now, the grip comfortable. They walked out into the room, as if they had always belonged there. Before they could take one step, a shadow detached itself from a cluster of people who had been watching the proceedings. Elias Langley. His steps were soundless for someone of his size. He came to stand beside Jamie, and looked at the broom. Then at the certificate edge, peeking from Jamie's pocket. The way he looked at the little secret was as if he'd read the same small print once too often. Curious, Langley said, in a voice that suggested he had been curious once, and decided to keep the habit. You're a long way from the service entrance. Jamie felt their face warm. They had expected confrontation, and found instead a kind of neutral interest that could be likened to a tax inspector's polite smile. Just making sure the trays are stocked, Jamie offered. Langley's gaze flicked to the head table and back. We are all performing roles tonight, he said, the operator of an old moral machine. Some are paid for their parts, others less so. There were layers here that Jamie did not understand. Langley, though, had the look of someone who had seen too many polished stories fall apart. He tilted his head toward the head table. They will call for a formal confirmation, Langley said softly. If the man whose signature sits on that certificate is a forger, we will see a ripple. If he is real, the ripple will look like a pebble. Consider the broom a piece of stage equipment. Stage equipment reveals sets. It is an honest craft. Jamie wanted to laugh at the use of the word broom as philosophy, but they only nodded. Langley's eyes lingered on Graham Calder for a second. He watches too much, Langley said. He has not laughed in a long time. Jamie thought about laughter as a currency. People laughed as applause. They laughed to buy back comfort. The idea that someone could spend decades without that currency felt almost indecent. It made Graham Calder's stillness larger, an absence rather than a presence. At the head table, Price continued his inspection. He had the vase in his hands, and the certificate on his knee. He tapped something under the rim with a small tool that clicked against ceramic standard procedure. The sort you see in documentaries and then forget. He looked up at Miranda and then at Evelyn. His mouth was a slit of concentration. These materials, he began, soft enough to hold the room hostage, could match earlier periods. However, he let the however hang. Miranda smiled a smile that seemed to have been carved by a sculptor with little patience for awkwardness. "Doctor," she said, the title in her voice. A baton she wielded to keep the band playing. "However," Price continued, "the emboss here is inconsistent with the registered seal at the Langley archive. The signature looks—" He tapped a line that relieved a piece of paper like a seamstress. Unpicking thread. "The signature looks mechanically pressed. I'll need to verify with the registry, and with the lab." 10 minutes. "I don't believe we have proof of long-standing provenance." There it was. Gap. 10 minutes stretched like a rubber band. Miranda's eyes narrowed, the mask momentarily cracking. The assistant's jaw clicked. Evelyn's face paled. Graham Calder folded his hands and looked as if the news was a scent to be noted. Jamie could feel the tension in the room, as if it were a physical thing. People leaned forward, their plates teetering. The applause that had been a currency was now debt. Voices moved, like a tide. Miranda's face did something then that no press release could have predicted. A tiny, sharp anger flared. It was practical and immediate, not unhinged. She stepped toward the staff not to cede the honor, but to control the narrative. "We can verify this ourselves," she said. "Bring the registry's contact number. We can reach out." Tonight? A plan that controls the narrative is worth its weight in favors. Miranda had the floor, and she used it to demand more certainty, more speed. Instead of demur, she offered contact. Instead of asking for patience, she ordered it. It was an elegant move. It bought her time, and it bought her an audience that was not ready to dismiss her yet. Jamie watched the assistant move to the phone. They felt the broom in their hand as if it were a baton primed for a reveal. It would be so simple to step forward, to sweep aside a napkin, to let the papers fall like confetti, and show the truth. But simplicity can be dangerous. The wrong reveal could look like a prank. The wrong timing could make the evidence seem contrived. Jamie had no training in courtroom procedure or in corporate scandal theater. They had, instead, a set of small truths, and an appetite for justice that felt righteous and dangerous in equal measures. Langley's hand tapped Jamie lightly on the shoulder. "If you move," he said quietly, "move with purpose, not with bravado. The room loves spectacle, but it also loves order. Tell me what you found." Jamie showed him the folded certificate. Langley's brows knitted. He took the paper with a slow hand and then folded it back into Jamie's palm as if passing a lit match. "Keep it ready," Langley said. "And keep the broom close. We may need theater. We will also need confirmation." Confirmation. It was Price's word again. He was professional and precise. And for all Miranda's confident flaunting, Price's reluctance was a third-party break. If Price found fabrication, the room would flip like a house of cards in a wind gust. At the far end of the table, Graham Calder noticed the shift. He had the look of a man who catalogued movements not as sleights, but as currency. His eyes did not flicker, they catalogued. He noted the assistant's slight paleness, the careful manner in which Miranda's hands felt like they were trying to keep a glass from tipping. He looked at Evelyn and something softened in the hard architecture of his face, like a seam under pressure. Then, almost casually as if he were noting an error in an accounting ledger, Graham turned his head and let his gaze sweep the room. It stopped, briefly, on Jamie. For the second time that night, someone else noticed that Jamie had been watching. Jamie felt the weight of that look. It was not disapproving. It was a calculation. Graham Calder is not a man who makes hasty judgments. His mind works like a lock. His face, like the polished metal at its mouth, reveals no keys. Jamie's palms were warm now. The broom felt ready. 10 minutes, Price said again, the authority of his line striking the room like a bell. He stood and took the vase toward the back hall for a microscopic test. The guests were murmuring now, phones in hands, 1,000 small feeds going out in 1,000 small ways. Miranda smiled for the cameras and, just as quickly, her face collected itself. For a woman who made an air of dependence her currency, she was ruthless in conducting damage control. She clasped Evelyn's hand in hers, and whispered a line that suggested solidarity. Evelyn's eyes registered more surprise than gratitude. There was a quiet panic at the edges of her smile now. Jamie felt time in their chest. 10 minutes can be an era. In the kitchen, a dishwasher banged, a tray clattered, and someone laughed too loudly. For Jamie, the world had been narrowed down to a broom, a certificate, and the idea that truth needed only 2 things to walk out into a room: exposure and a witness with enough credibility to make people listen. They tightened their grip. Someone at the other end of the floor called out, "If you're keeping track, that appraiser is the real deal." The name drop was aimed at swaying votes. Miranda smiled again, and moved like a woman wrapping a story in silk. Jamie found Langley's eyes once more. He gave them the barest of nods, a signal, not in order. The nod said what words could not. Be precise, be brave, be quick. Jamie took one step toward the head table with the broom propped like a spear of common sense. The air carried the scent of lemon from the cleaning supplies, and the perfume of old money perfume. Plates clinked. Glasses chimed. Someone laughed in a place where laughter felt like an incongruity. They had not yet swept anything. They had not yet made the reveal, but they were moving into the space where reveal becomes possible. At the exact moment, Jamie stepped forward. A voice rose, a voice, like ice sliding across steel. It was Graham Calder, and his voice, when he used it, made people listen, not because it was loud, but because it was final. "Hold," he said. The room abated reflexively. Conversations thinned. The cameras cleared a path like seaweed parting. People turned their faces to him, hungry for direction. Miranda's smile flickered like a candle in a draught. Langley inclined his head minutely. In the whole building, 2 men who rarely showed warmth watched in the same direction. Graham Calder had not smiled yet tonight. He had not smiled in public for a long time, and he had the kind of reputation that made silence feel sharp as glass. He was the axis on which the room rotated, the man whose look could tilt a tide. He rose, a motion that included the economy of a puppet master. The room stilled. Jamie felt the broom against their palm like something both ridiculous and holy. "Let the appraiser do his work," Graham said. "If this is as genuine as Miss Vale claims, we will celebrate the philanthropy. If it is not, we will address the misrepresentation. We do not punish spectacle. We insist on truth." There was something in the firmness of his tone that made people nod, not because they trusted him, but because they had to. He had threaded a line between spectacle and process, and hung the whole room on it. Evelyn relaxed a fraction, and the room exhaled. Miranda's face tightened into a mask repaired by force. She nodded, the smile becoming a strategy again. Jamie felt the tension in the broom loosen. But then Price's assistant called from the back hallway. "Preliminary checks suggest irregularities in the certificate." Whispers rose like wind in dry leaves. Miranda's hand went to her assistant. Evelyn's color fled. The head table sagged as if someone had unhooked a weight and not yet put it down. Jamie's feet moved before their mind had finished translating the alarm. They began to walk forward, broom in hand, toward the stage, toward the head table, toward the moment where a small thing could alter the evening's arc. Langley walked with them, an ancient shadow at their side, while Graham Calder watched like a man looking at a chessboard. The crowd hushed and leaned as Jamie came into clearer view. Cameras pivoted, Someone laughed nervously. Someone else cleared their throat. Jamie reached the edge of the head table. The world, for a second, narrowed to the sound of a fork clattering, and the breath between notes of a held tune. They lifted the broom. A soft gasp moved through the room. The broom touched cloth. The broom nudged. A napkin shifted. A corner of paper peeked out from beneath the napkin like a small creature revealing itself. And, in that breath, the room leaned in. They had not yet swept. They had only begun. The reveal had not fallen. The certificate still sat, partly hidden. A rumor about to be torn open. From across the room, Graham Calder's face changed by the width of an eyelid. It nothing like a smile, yet more like a release valve clicking, a recognition that something unexpected had been set into motion, but it was a movement with the potential to transform. Jamie's hand was steady. The broom trembled like a conductor's baton poised to strike the downbeat, and the room waited, every face a question, if the night had been a play. The first act had just reached the point where the set piece was tugged sideways, and the audience could guess the consequences. Jamie inhaled. They were about to sweep. The napkin slid like a small white flag. For a heartbeat, the paper hung between dignity and discovery. The way a page in a book pauses when a dog-eared secret is about to show itself. Then, Jamie's broom, mundane, scuffed thing that had never been invited to a gala, completed the motion, and the certificate toppled free. It landed on the polished tablecloth, with the soft apology of printed paper meeting silk. Cameras clicked in reflex. Someone gasped. The whispering tide swelled into a single, held sound. What had been a carefully rehearsed tableau at the head table was suddenly punctured by an object so ordinary it became almost rude. Jamie straightened. The broom still angled in their hands. The certificate lay face up, ridiculous, and faint, under the Gala. Lights a glossy print, the Remington Heritage seal, an old convenient name, and, most importantly, a tiny barcode sticker curling at the corner. Someone near the servers let out a laugh that tried to be quiet and failed. Miranda's smile convulsed. The practiced ease with which she had owned the room dipped, then frayed. For a moment she stared at the paper as if studying the texture of betrayal. Then her posture recovered enough for indignation. "Excuse me," she said, a phrase that could be either a rebuke or an order. "Who put that there?" "You tell me," Jamie replied before they could think better of it. The line came not from training but from a kind of instinct, the same one that had moved their hand toward the broom. It was a small gamble. Call attention, and the room might pivot toward spectacle, remain mute, and the paper might be smoothed away. They held the broom like a question mark. Miranda's assistant, his headset suddenly conspicuous, lurched forward to retrieve the certificate. His hand hovered, uncertain, as if afraid to touch the fragile new truth. Langley, who had followed Jamie like a patient tide, stepped closer, and placed a steady palm on the assistant's shoulder. It was a gesture as quiet as a closing gate. "Let the appraiser see it," Langley said, his voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume, "and give the registry a call." Dr. Rohan Price took the certificate so delicately. A surgeon might have been jealous. He held it with the gloves he had already used on the vase, and turned it gently toward the light. His eyebrows rarely, animated, lifted a fraction. He tapped the barcode with one gloved finger and, without a fanfare, set the paper down on his pad. "That barcode," he said, "is not the usual provenance sticker." It took the world a few beats to notice exactly what that meant. People had memorized the chord progression of this kind of evening. They knew when to clap, where to direct cameras, how to smile. The phrase "not the usual provenance sticker" was a chord played in a wrong key. Phones rose like a flock of eager birds. Someone produced a phone and scanned the barcode, because the room had become a creature of algorithms. The social feed needed supply. The link came up within seconds. Lark and Wren props. Decorative rental item number 43,291. Not an antique, ceramic, reproduction. The words did the work of a hammer hitting a crystal glass. Conversation shattered into sharp little pieces. Miranda moved first. Not with the crisp, staged calm she preferred, but with the twitchy momentum of someone whose rehearsal had been interrupted. "That's impossible," she said. "This is a misunderstanding. Those props are someone is planting things." "Planting," Langley repeated softly. And the way he said the word was not an accusation but an observation that fit like a seam, or staging. Miranda's assistant reached instinctively for the certificate. As if to snatch it back, a hand blocked him. Graham Calder's. He had not been the one to rise, but the chair at his left cleared an unexpected man-shaped space in the center of the room. His fingers closed around the assistant's wrist with a firmness that was neither violent nor letting go. The assistant's jaw worked. He found himself looking into an expression that, for the third time that night, meant more than it allowed. "Don't touch evidence tonight," Graham said. The sentence landed like a ledger entry. Miranda's eyes darted from face to face, as if searching for a stage manager who would call, cut, and restore order. There was none. Dr. Price, professional, an efficient head, already taken out his phone. He dialed the registry number and, in voice quiet enough not to show the shift in tempo, asked for an immediate verification. Phones were held to ears, like talismans. People who had moments ago been thinking of projection maps and donation brackets now listened to a disinterested voice on a line in the middle of the biggest room in Calder atrium. "We have a match," Dr. Price said quietly, and then, sharper, for the benefit of those nearest him, "But it is a negative match. The record shows that this seal is not in the registry. The signature is not a match with the claimed donor. The item number corresponds to a rental prop." A ripple moved through the crowd. A man 2 tables down muttered the word forgery, the way someone might accidentally say fire and everyone nearest him recoil or lean in. Cameras rose on tripods and phones like a choruses. Would not remain private for long. Miranda tried to smile. It was the wrong weapon. "This is somebody is sabotaging my reputation," she declared. "There are people who stand to lose if this grant goes through. I have receipts." Jamie felt something like a hands-on-the-knife moment. If she could produce receipts, then perhaps the story could be spun back into coherence. But Jamie's memory held a different kind of receipt though. When they had slipped into their jacket pocket from the catering pile, they stepped forward and, with the broom tucked under their arm like a flag, unfolded the printed invoice and held it up. "Here," Jamie said, voice loud enough for the table, and not louder than was decent. "Lark and Wren props. Order number 43,291. Delivery time 9. Signed by a courier who left at 9:10. The words landed as proof. But proof in a room that was averse to pain was a new sensation. Phones panned, people leaned, and the assistant's hands went pale. Someone in the back of the room, one of the more junior board members, tapped their screen and scrolled to a feed that already had the moment being captioned. Gala. Drama. Antique vase. Maybe a prop. The internet was tasting its dinner. Miranda's voice turned electric. "This is theft of reputation. Someone is trying to make me look bad because I threatened, because you demanded that the board push a grant your interests favor?" Langley cut in. His voice was not particularly loud, only precise. "You were convincing people to change a board vote tonight in the name of philanthropy. That is not illegal. It can be manipulative. It is not a crime. Planting false proof to bolster trust is. Who are you to decide intent?" Miranda snapped. She looked like a woman who had been paid to play a role, and had suddenly been handed a script with no ending. And then, as if to underline the drama with stagecraft, A waiter tripped on a stray cord. Not disastrously, it was the kind of stumble that sends a ripple through the immediate vicinity, but causes no injury. His tray tilted, a carafe wobbled, a splash of wine took a small arc, and landed at the edge of the head table in a tiny, theatrical comet. The chain of events was absurd enough to become comic. The carafe hit the floor, skittered toward a foot, siphoned across a shoe, and left a dark ring on the polished stone. The comedy made some faces. Nervous smiles peeking through the outrage. Graham Calder's jaw, which had been a sculptor's study, in reserve, loosened by the width of a breath. It was not a laugh yet, just the initial giving of constriction. The nose bridge, soft. The corners of his mouth, which had been under strict embargo for years, twitched. Nobody in the room had cultivated Graham Calder's face into a puppet. They had built a myth around it. Tonight, the myth was cracking around a laugh. Dr. Price ended his call, and announced to the room, "The registry has no record. The material composition tests we've done here preliminarily indicate modern glazing and pigments. We'll run lab samples, but from these tests, and from the record, I'd say this is a reproduction intended for set design." Gasps, and quiet scolding, ebbed out, and then built. Miranda's breathing shifted. Her defense moved from rhetoric into negotiation to lower stakes. Frantic. "Even if it's a prop, we can still redirect the donation," she said. "The causes are the same." Evelyn, sitting small and pale, finally found a voice like a pebble dropped into a pond. "I did not ask for this," she said. Her words were simple and stunned. The relief in her voice was not vindictive. It was the relief of someone who feared being weaponized. Langley nodded toward her, as if acknowledging that the point had been made. Then he swiveled his attention back to Jamie and the broom. "Young person," he said. "You broke the set." "Someone had to," Jamie answered. They felt lightheaded with the height of the moment. The broom in their hands, the certificate like a stage prop folded. They had played a small, ridiculous part, and watched it become a hinge. The crowd divided itself like light through glass. Some people closed ranks around Miranda, old allies who had seen her as a conduit to influence. Others, suddenly embarrassed for having clapped too readily, found new objects of attention. The assistants caller-eyed the catering invoices, the accounts of donations. Social currency redistributed itself. Miranda's composure, finally, ruptured. She stood abruptly, the kind of movement that reads as both flight and fight, and lashed out with words that were half command and half fear. "This is a smear. Someone paid someone to plant. That who benefits?" "Who is Ms. Vale?" Graham Calder said. Voice papered, with a new kind of gravity. "No one here benefits from spectacles that are false. We benefit from authenticity. If you brought this with good intent, you will show us the trail. If you did not." The sentence hung, not as a threat, but as a ledger. Miranda's face crumpled into an expression that was not purely angered now. It had a dent of panic, the shade of someone who had overplayed a hand and realized the stakes were deeper than applause. At that moment, a different kind of confirmation. A ribbed, quiet, efficient text message from Dr. Price to his assistant, that someone near the speakers read aloud so the room could confirm it. "Lab confirms, modern composite. Photograph match with rental catalog. Image recommend, nullifying claims." The room reacted as if the verdict had been passed in a court of law. Miranda's shoulders collapsed like a theater curtain. Her assistant, slack, with the awareness that prepared scripts never end this badly, fumbled for his phone, and typed a brief, trembling message that looked like an attempt to sever a lifeline. Outside the Gala's glass doors, a murmured crowd, journalists, plus the inevitable human curiosity, moved, as news did, fast and hungry. Someone shouted a pithy line. Someone else laughed, in the sudden lightness of a scandal that wasn't criminal, but curiously satisfying. Miranda backed away from the head table. her heels a series of nervous punctuation marks. As she turned, her heel snagged on the runner the catering crew had forgotten to tape down. It was the sort of theatrical stumble that would have been tragic in any other setting. Here it was! Comet. She spun. Her hand connected with the display of decorative orchids, and with a soft, embarrassing clatter a plastic crate of stage flowers tumbled into a heap. No one was hurt. The sound was undignified. The sight of expensive shoes in a plastic tangle sent a ripple of stifled laughter through the crowd, and then it happened. The laugh. It did not emerge like a recorded cue. It started as a small sound from Graham Calder, involuntary release that snuck across the room like warmth. It wasn't mockery. It was the sound of someone who had been holding a shape in his chest so long that when the pressure eased he couldn't hold himself together. It passed from him like light through crystal, brightening faces in its path, altering the room's temperature. He laughed again, fuller, this time. There was a richness to it that was almost surprised at its own existence. People who had never heard him laugh before shifted. Cameras captured it. It spread like a contagion of relief. Some people clapped, others didn't know whether to clap. Evelyn smiled. Not in triumph, but in relief. Jamie's breath lodged, then eased. Langley closed his mouth and let a chuckle escape. The old man's version of vindication. Graham's laugh was not cruel. It was the sound of a man who had watched theater for so long that when he finally saw an honest reveal, he forgot the rules that governed his face. It was the sound of a person offered a human moment unexpected, clean, and not his to hide. Miranda, still untangling herself from floral foam, looked up, and met his gaze. For the first time that night, she saw not the mockery she had feared, but something like pity, wrapped in a strange warmth. The heat of her shame cooled a fraction under the gaze. "I'm sorry," she said. Too low for the cameras, but loud enough for the head table. Evelyn, whose night had been forced into the kind of public narrative no one should ever be forced to inhabit, rose before anyone could lob a pre-packaged line of forgiveness. She moved to Miranda, as if deciding whether to extend a hand, or the cold of social distance. She chose a hand. "We'll figure out what happened," Evelyn said. Her voice was not theatrical, it was real. Miranda took the hand like a drowning person, taking a rope. For a second there was an exchange that the cameras couldn't quite parse. Not a wedding or a partnership, but the unadorned transaction of two people who had found themselves on the same unexpected shore. Outside, paparazzi voices rose and fell like tide. Inside, the room recalibrated. The moral ledger had not yet been balanced. Contracts would still be scrutinized. Reputations would need repair. But the immediate theater had been undone, and in its place, something else inevitably messy, human, and a little hopeful had been left. Langley cleared his throat, and smiled, in a way that suggested he had seen worse, and better. He stepped forward and, with the authority of someone who had been given the pleasure of seeing truth revealed, tapped the table lightly. "We will follow proper channels," he said, "but for tonight, perhaps we can restore the balance. Dr. Price, please document. Security, please escort Miss Vale's assistant out to answer questions. And someone," he gestured slightly toward the catering manager, "please tape down the runner." Graham's laugh subsided into a soft exhale, and for the first time Jamie saw the man who had been known for being unmoved actually count, as if reconciling columns in his head. He rose from his seat, without the habitual stiffness. When he spoke again his voice had the rare warmth of someone stepping out from behind glass. "Miss Vale," he said, addressing Miranda with the courtesy of a courtroom, "if there's a misunderstanding, we will sort it. If there has been deception, we will address it fairly." Miranda nodded, cheeks flushed. She did not fight. The assistant, his role evaporating, stepped aside and left with a hurried apology. Security, polite and discreet, made a tidy scene of escorting him out. No one made a spectacle of him. The room's appetite had moved on. As the immediate tension diffused, people began to talk, in new ways. Board members huddled, phones made calculations, and an undercurrent of relief threaded through servers rearranging plates. Cameras kept clicking. Not out of malice now, but because a different kind of story had been birthed. The one where the intern with the broom unmasked a fraud, and the man who never smiled laughed. Jamie felt their legs trembled as adrenaline leaked into their limbs. Langley squeezed their shoulder. No fanfare. Only the old man's approval. "Well done," he said simply. Before the applause could gather into a tangible gesture, Graham Calder rose. The room turned. He walked with measured economy to the head table, and people straightened as if someone had corrected their posture for them. He stopped a respectful distance from Jamie, and looked at them as if trying to fit a new piece into a familiar frame. "Young person," he said quietly. "That was a tidy piece of work." Jamie heard the compliment like a coin clinking in their palm. It was rare and valuable. They could not help a small flush. Their training had not counted on praise from an icon. "Thank you, sir," they answered. It came out earnest, and then, to their surprise, a little playful. "It was dusty work." Graham's laugh fluttered again, brief, private. He reached into his pocket, produced a small card, and placed it on the table between them. "Come to my office tomorrow at 9, he said. "We need people who notice things." It was not a promise of a promotion spelled out in HR terms. It was better. An invitation into a world where attention was currency, and where the man who never smiled had just given a kind of recognition that mattered more than any title. Jamie folded the card into their palm like a treaty. Later, in interviews that would run on morning feeds and social feeds alike, the moment would be cut into bites. The broom, the barcode, the falling flowers, the laugh. People would pick which frame they liked and paste it into their feeds. But the room itself, in the minutes that followed, was doing something less photographed and more real. People were apologizing for clapping too soon. People were making space for explanation. And someone had called for a replacement centerpiece and a new donation plan that this time had been vetted properly. In the backstage hush, after the minor storm had passed, Graham lingered at the head table. He watched Evelyn, whose cheeks had regained color, speaking quietly with Langley about logistics and public statements. He watched Jamie, who stood awkwardly as a sudden wave of congratulations washed over them. He watched Miranda, who was being offered because human beings in this sort of theater tend to show mercy when things go as far as humiliation on exit that allowed dignity. It was then that Langley spoke, his voice low and almost conspiratorial, as if sharing a chapter from a book he had carried for years. "You have a laugh inside you," he said to Graham. Not a question. Graham considered the remark. He had spent most of his life tightening seams. Laughter had been an idle expense. He found his hands resting on the table edge, the knuckles white for a second. Around him, the room was rearranging its priorities, and the soft fall of someone's laughter earlier had loosened something in him he hadn't known how to access. "I suppose I did not think I'd ever have the time," he said. The words were small, humble, like a man letting a window open for the first time in a long winter. Langley chuckled. "Time is what you make of it." A reporter edged closer with that look that meant soundbite, but Graham waved him away, not brusque, only private. He looked at Jamie again, and offered a nod. That was almost a benediction. After the event, there would be meetings, and memos, and statements, but for the moment the atrium breathed with a different air. Evelyn walked over and stood in front of Jamie, half wanting to thank, half wanting to protect an odd tenderness there that surprised them both. "Could you?" she began, then halted, rummaging for words. "Would you consider being on the committee for the new youth initiative? We could use someone who thinks with their hands." Jamie laughed a small, incredulous sound. "I'll bring the broom," they said, and the joking line loosened the space between them, sincere and unreinvented. That night, people left with a story. The intern, the broom, the laugh. But not everyone left unchanged. Miranda escorted gently away by PR handlers whose job was now to do damage control, had a moment in the corridor when she stopped and looked back at the glittering atrium. Her face not a mask, but a real human face showed the cost of a night performed as if it were a ladder. She adjusted her coat and took a deep breath. A step that felt, for the cameras, like the beginning of an exit, rather than the end of a story. Outside, as taxis lined the curb, and the city exhaled, the feeds began to populate, with angles and editorials. Social media users declared themselves Team Intern, Team Air, or Team Calder, as if a night that had been messy and human could be corralled into fan allegiance. The truth is messier. People are seldom one thing. Miranda had motives. She had probably not set out to be the villain, just an actor who had forgotten that people could see behind the set. Back in his office the next morning, Graham Calder looked at the city from behind the same unyielding glass that had made his face into a myth. But the glass was no longer a screen between him and the world. It was a transparency he could see through if he chose. He sat at his desk and reached unconsciously for his coffee. He let out an amused sound later than a laugh, heavier than a grenade, because habit had to be addressed. Slowly, he stood and found the broom Jamie had left, inadvertently leaning against the service cot in the reception area. It looked absurd in the executive suite so far above the service corridors. He held it like someone holding a relic. It felt ridiculous and, at the same time, ordinary in the way that truth can be. He pushed at a discarded stack of quarterly reports. The broom made a gentle noise across paper, a small sound, like a metronome. Graham, who had never practiced being anything other than a machine for decisions, found himself smiling a little. It was not a full laugh yet, but it was a concession to the possibility. The next day the office hummed with new energy. Jamie came in, card tucked in a pocket, like a small victory. They were met in the lobby by an assistant who had been given the task no more and handed an envelope with a small note from Graham. See me at 9. Inside was the formal offer. A paid position on a new team to handle authenticity and community partnerships. Along with the letter was a humble-looking broom keychain, and a business card with Graham Calder's name printed like a small, private joke. Jamie laughed a single, delighted exhalant, pocketed both. Evelyn, on her side, began making calls to restructure the grant process. She insisted on transparency because she had learned, in a single sharp night, how easily trust could be engineered. Langley monitored the shifts with the measured pleasure of a man who had watched a small injustice correct. He sent an email to the board. Tonight we learned we should verify before we amplify. Miranda's exit was quiet. In the weeks that followed, she kept a low profile and, in a few interviews, admitted her misstep with a mix of contrition and the kind of battered frankness that made some people sympathetic. Her ambitions had not disappeared. They had been rewritten into a cautionary tale. No one cheered her downfall, but few celebrated her frailty either. People tend to prefer neat endings, but life insisted on the messy middle. As for Graham, the laugh that had escaped him at the gala did not turn him into someone wholly transformed overnight. He continued to be meticulous, exacting, and resolute, but something had been loosened. He found himself listening more in meetings, letting sentences end where before he might have pressed them down. When Jamie reported in the following week with a detailed memo about verifying provenance and community feedback, he read it with the attention of a man who had been given a small nudge toward humility. One afternoon, the two met in the atrium. No gala, no cameras, just the same long tables and the same pool of light. Jamie held a replacing broom, this one a gift, not the same service scuff, but an honest one, and set it in the corner with its bristles, like a salute. "How's the broom treating you?" Graham asked, and there was a tease in his voice that would have been unthinkable a month before. Jamie shrugged, with a grin. "We build trust, one sweep at a time," they said. Graham nodded, and then, with something like mischief, mimicked the sweeping motion. It looked absurd. It was, at once, a small comedy and an enormous confession. He laughed, not loudly but cleanly, and Jamie laughed back. Outside the corporate calendar, the city kept moving, and stories reassembled into their own shapes. People who had been at the gala told the tale at dinner parties and on trains. In comments and thread replies, small jokes about the Broom moment proliferated. It became a shorthand for when the small and honest deflated the grand and false. On social platforms, the moment was clipped into different edits. Some focused on Graham's laugh, some on the cinematic broom sweep, and others on Evelyn's dignified handling of the situation. 1,000 editorial hands tried to make the story fit their angle. The truth refused to be neat. An intern's courage, a CEO's laugh, an opportunist's fall, a woman's relief. None of it gave up its texture to headlines. Weeks later, Graham called a small meeting and announced a new initiative: the Calder Transparency Fund. It wasn't dramatic. It was a set of policies and a committee. Jamie was named to it. Evelyn co-chaired. Langley offered counsel. The fund's mission was practical, clear: vetting of donations, open registries, community representation. It was not a miracle. It was a collection of modest reforms that, over time, could shape better habits. On a quiet evening, after the fund's first meeting, Graham walked the atrium alone. He paused at the place where, weeks earlier, a broom had nudged a napkin, and the night's trajectory had altered. He looked up at the ceiling where lights still glinted like stars and, for a moment, allowed himself to remember the sound of his own laughter rolling across that space. It felt like a small theft of something he hadn't known he needed. Relief. He picked up the broom keychain that had once been a joke and slipped it onto his desk. It sat beside his ledger, like a curious artifact, a reminder that sometimes truth needs only a humble hand, and that even the most fortified edges can crack into light. Jamie, working at their new desk, often found himself smiling when he caught sight of the card Graham had given him, not just because it meant pay and a future, but because it meant permission. Permission to notice, to act, to be seen by someone whose attention had once seemed impenetrable. Evelyn took a walk one afternoon, past a community center that had applied for the new funds grant. She remembered how easy it had been to be a foil in someone else's script. Her determination now was the steadier sort. Quieter, but broader. She walked beside a street vendor and listened. She volunteered an afternoon to teach a class. At the center, people who had been spectators became collaborators. As for Miranda, the narrative of the woman who had tried to ascend on borrowed authenticity lingered in the margins. She took workshops, registered a small jewelry line with clearer provenance, and in time sought to repair public trust. She would not vanish into obscurity, nor would she be welcomed with open arms. The world is not that tidy. Months passed and, in the cadence of human life, the Broom moment sometimes felt like a memory from a different life. But then, sometimes, when a meeting grew tiresome, or when a campaign felt like spin, someone would say, half joking, half solemn, "Remember the Broom?" Laughter would ripple around the room, then a private signal that truth, even mundane truth, could still unsettle the stage. Graham kept laughing, in small increments, like a man who learned he might prefer to spend some of his strictness on joy. It did not make him less formidable. It made him more human. When he did smile now, people noticed, not because it was a miracle, but because it was a sign of a leader who could make space for error and remedy. One quiet week later, Jamie found themselves supervising a small community event funded by the Transparency Fund. They stood near a table where volunteers arranged homemade cookies. A child ran by with a paper crown and shouted something about knights and brooms, and Jamie laughed until their chest hurt. The broom from the gala set, now symbolic, in a display case at the funds office, with a plaque that read simply, "Small tools, big truth." The story of that night traveled in many forms. Some told it as comedy, some as cautionary tale, others as a small miracle of accountability. But the thing that stayed with most people was not the viral clip or the punchline. It was the image of a room that had been poised for spectacle and, because of one person's attention and one ordinary broom, decided instead to choose honesty. In the end, it was not about punishment. It was about an exposure that allowed repair. It was about a CEO who had not been seen laughing in years, and found that his laughter could open a room rather than close it. It was about an intern who noticed small seams and decided to pull them, not for glory, but because they couldn't watch a lie be applauded. And when, later that year, Calder Industries held a smaller, more intimate donor event, someone left a broom leaning politely against the service cart. Jamie smiled when they saw it. So did Graham, who passed by and, without pretense, picked it up and gave the corner of the atrium a ceremonial, absurd sweep. The motion was clumsy and right, the kind of human thing that made others laughed this time, with him. It was a laugh that never felt like a punchline again. It had become a punctuation, an acknowledgement that, sometimes, the smallest gestures bring down the largest illusions, and the world, for the briefest of moments, makes room for honest joy. If you loved the sudden catharsis of the broom moment, the little victory against a big performance, let someone else see it, share the clip or the story. Tell them that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to notice,